Hello everyone. Hello from the underground. A term nicked from the pages of Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground, which we'll be reading in a moment. There isn't really much needed to set up this short story. The narrative in it is perfectly self-contained and sort of, therefore, everything human is seamlessly stitched into the main character, who we'll be exploring. We'll be doing our best not to role play per se, but I have a really difficult time reading this story and not finding myself in it. And there you have the underground, I suppose. Every human impulse before it becomes nurtured to the point of fruition is necessarily an underground movement, something subversive to mainstream narrative, I think. And there, I think we might celebrate what it means to be human. A hurrah for the underground. So, let's read a lot tonight. It is April 2020, the 13th. Sun is long set, so I think we're in this together now. I'd love to have a discussion on what we read later. Maybe we can keep a forum open for it. Keep the comments open. I'm sorry this isn't being live streamed. I, in fact, tried moving away from YouTube, but I just can't seem to. Alas. Alright, anyways. Here we have Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. Part 1. Underground. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unpleasant man. I think my liver is diseased. However, I don't know beans about my disease, and I'm not sure what is bothering me. I don't treat it and never have, though I respect medicine and doctors. Besides, I am extremely superstitious, let's say sufficiently so to respect medicine. I am educated enough not to be superstitious, but I am. No, I refuse to treat it out of spite. You probably will not understand that well, but I understand it. Of course, I can't explain to you just whom I am annoying in this case by my spite. I am perfectly well aware that I cannot get even with the doctors by not consulting them. I know better than anyone that I thereby injure only myself and no one else. But still, if I don't treat it, it is out of spite. My liver is bad. Well, then, let it get even worse. I have been living like that for a long time now. 20 years. I am 40 now. I used to be in the civil service, but no longer am. I was a spiteful official. I was rude and took pleasure in being so. After all, I did not accept bribes, so I was bound to find a compensation in that, at least. A bad joke, but I will not cross it out. I wrote it thinking it would sound very witty, but now that I see myself that I only wanted to show off in a despicable way, I will purposely not cross it out. When petitioners would come to my desk for information, I would gnash my teeth at them and feel intense enjoyment when I succeeded in distressing someone. I was almost always successful. For the most part, they were all timid people. Of course, they were petitioners. But among the fops, there was one officer in particular I could not endure. He simply would not be humble and clanked his sword in a disgusting way. I carried on a war with him for 18 months over that sword. At last I got the better of him. He left off clanking it. However, that happened when I was still young. But do you know, gentlemen, what the real point of my spite was? Why, the whole trick, the real vileness of it, lay in the fact that continually, even in moments of the worst spleen, I was inwardly conscious with shame that I was not only not spiteful, but not even an embittered man, that I was simply frightening sparrows at random and amusing myself by it. I might foam at the mouth, but bring me some kind of toy, give me a cup of tea with sugar, and I would be appeased. My heart might even be touched, though probably I would gnash my teeth at myself afterwards and lie awake at night with shame for months after. That is the way I am. I was lying when I said just now that I was a spiteful official. I was lying out of spite. I was simply indulging myself with the petitioners and with the officer, but I could never really become spiteful. Every moment I was conscious in myself of many, very many elements completely opposite to that. I felt them positively taming in me, these opposite elements. I knew that they had been taming in me all my life, begging to be let out, but I would not let them, purposefully would not let them out. They tormented me till I was ashamed. They drove me to convulsions, and finally they bored me. How they bored me. Well, are you not imagining, gentlemen, that I am repenting for something now? That I am asking your forgiveness for something? I am sure you are imagining that. However, I assure you it does not matter to me if you are. Not only could I not become spiteful, I could not even become anything, neither spiteful nor kind, neither a rascal nor an honest man, neither a hero nor an insect. Now I am living out my life in my corner, taunting myself with a spiteful and useless consolation that an intelligent man cannot seriously become anything, and that only a fool can become something. Yes, an intelligent man in the 19th century must and morally ought to be preeminently a characterless creature. A man of character, an active man, is preeminently a limited creature. That is the conviction of my 40 years. I am 40 years old now, and 40 years, after all, is a whole lifetime. After all, that is extreme old age. To live longer than 40 years is bad manners. It is vulgar, immoral. Who does live beyond 40? Answer that, sincerely and honestly. I will tell you who do. Fools and worthless people do. I tell all old men that to their face. All those respectable old men, all those silver-haired and reverend old men. I tell the world that to its face. I have a right to say so, for I'll go on living to 60 myself. I'll live till 70, till 80. Wait, let me catch my breath. No doubt you think, gentlemen, that I want to amuse you. You are mistaken in that, too. I am not at all such a merry person as you imagine, or as you may imagine. However, if irritated by all this babble, and I can feel that you are irritated, you decide to ask me just who I am, then my answer is, I am a certain low-ranked civil servant. I was in the service in order to have something to eat, but only for that reason. And when last year a distant relation left me 6,000 roubles in his will, I immediately retired from the service and settled down in my corner. I used to live in this corner before, but now I have settled down in it. My room is a wretched, horrid one on the outskirts of town. My servant is an old country woman, spiteful out of stupidity, and moreover, she always smells bad. I am told that the Petersburg climate is bad for me, and that with my paltry means it is very expensive to live in Petersburg. I know all that better than all these sage and experienced counselors and monitors, but I'm going to stay in Petersburg. I will not leave Petersburg. I will not leave because, what does it matter in the least whether I leave or stay? But incidentally, what can a decent man speak about with the greatest pleasure? Answer, about himself. Well, then, I will talk about myself. Part 2. Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. Now I want to tell you, gentlemen, whether you care to hear it or not, why I could not even become an insect. I tell you solemnly that I wanted to become an insect many times, but it was not even worthy of that. I swear to you, gentlemen, that to be hyper-conscious is a disease, a real positive disease. Ordinary human consciousness would be too much for man's everyday needs. That is, half or a quarter of the amount which falls into the lot of a cultivated man of our unfortunate 19th century, especially one who has the particular misfortune to inhabit Petersburg, the most abstract and intentional city in the whole world. There are intentional and unintentional cities. It would have been quite enough, for instance, to have the consciousness by which all so-called straightforward person and men of action live. I bet you think I am writing all this to show off, to be witty at the expense of men of action. And what is more, that out of ill-bred showing off, I am clanking a sword, like my officer. But gentlemen, whoever can pride himself on his disease and even show off with them? However, what am I talking about? Everyone does that. They do pride themselves on their diseases, and I, perhaps, more than anyone. There is no doubt about it. My objection was absurd. Yet just the same, I am firmly convinced not only that a great deal of consciousness, but that any consciousness is a disease. I insist on it. Let us drop that too for a minute. Tell me this. Why did it happen that at the very moment when I was most capable of recognizing every refinement of all the sublime and beautiful, as we used to say at one time, I would, as though purposely, not only feel, but do such hideous things, such that, well, in short, such as everyone probably does, but which, as though purposely, occurred to me at the very time when I was most conscious that they ought not to be done. The more conscious I was of goodness, and of all that sublime and beautiful, the more deeply I sank into my mire, and the more capable I became of sinking into it completely. But the main thing was that all this did not seem to occur in me accidentally, but as though it had to be so. As though it were my most normal condition, and not in the least disease or depravity, so that finally I even lost the desire to struggle against this depravity. It ended by my almost believing, perhaps actually believing, that probably this was really my normal condition. But at first, in the beginning, that is, what agonies I suffered in that struggle. I did not believe that others went through the same things, and therefore I hid this fact about myself as a secret all my life. I was ashamed. Perhaps I am even ashamed now. I reached the point of feeling a sort of secret, abnormal, despicable enjoyment in returning home to my corner on some disgusting Petersburg night, and being acutely conscious that that day I had again done something loathsome, that what was done could never be undone, and secretly, inwardly, gnaw at myself for it, nagging and consuming myself, till at last the bitterness turned into a sort of shameful, accursed sweetness, and finally into real positive enjoyment. Yes, into enjoyment. I insist upon that. And that is why I have started to speak, because I keep wanting to know for a fact whether other people feel such an enjoyment. Let me explain. The enjoyment here consisted precisely in this hyper-consciousness of one's own degradation. It was from feeling oneself that one had reached the last barrier, that it was nasty, but that it could not be otherwise, that you no longer had an escape, that you could never become a different person, that even if there remained enough time and faith for you to change into something else, you probably would not want to change. Or if you did want to, even then you would do nothing. Because perhaps In reality, there was nothing for you to change into, and the worst of it, at the root of it all, was that it all proceeded according to the normal and fundamental laws of hyperconsciousness, and with the inertia that was the direct result of those laws, and that, consequently, one could not only not change, but one could do absolutely nothing. Thus it would follow, as the result of hyperconsciousness, that one is not to blame for being a scoundrel, as though that were any consolation to the scoundrel once he himself had come to realize that he actually is a scoundrel. But enough. Bah, I have talked a lot of nonsense, but what have I explained? Can this enjoyment be explained? But I will explain it. I will get to the bottom of it. That is why I have taken up my pen. To take an instance, I am terribly vain. I am as suspicious and touchy as a hunchback or a dwarf. But to tell the truth, there have been moments when if somebody had happened to slap my face, I would, perhaps, have even been glad at that. I say, very seriously, that I would probably have been able to discover a particular sort of enjoyment, even in that. The enjoyment, of course, of despair. But in despair occur the most intense enjoyments, especially when one is very acutely conscious of one's hopeless position. As for the slap in the face, why, then the consciousness of being beaten to a pulp would positively overwhelm one. The worst of it is, no matter how I tried, it still turned out that I was always the most to blame in everything. And what is most humiliating of all, to blame for no fault of my own, but, so to say, through the laws of nature. In the first place, to blame because I am cleverer than any of the people surrounding me. I have always considered myself cleverer than any of the people surrounding me, and sometimes, would you believe it, I have even been ashamed of that. At any rate, all my life I have, as it were, looked away, and I could never look people straight in the eye. To blame, finally, because even if I were magnanimous, I would only have suffered more from the consciousness of all its uselessness. After all, I would probably never have been able to do anything with my magnanimity. Neither to forgive, for my assailant may have slapped me because of the laws of nature, and one cannot forgive the laws of nature, nor to forget, for even if it were the laws of nature, it is insulting all the same. Finally, if I had wanted to be anything but magnanimous, had desired on the contrary to revenge myself on the man who insulted me, I could not have revenged myself on anyone, for anything, because I would certainly never have made up my mind to do anything, even if I had been able to. Why would I not have made up my mind? I want to say a few words about that in particular. Chapter 3 of Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. After all, people who know how to revenge themselves and to take care of themselves in general, how do they do it? After all, when they are possessed, let us suppose, by the feeling of revenge, then, for the time, there is nothing else but that feeling left in their whole being. Such a man simply rushes straight towards his object like an infuriated bull with its horns down, and nothing but a wall will stop him. By the way, facing the wall, such people, that is, the straightforward person and men of action, are genuinely nonplussed. For them a wall is not an evasion, as for example for us people who think and consequently do nothing. It is not an excuse for turning aside, an excuse for which our kind is always very glad, though we scarcely believe in it ourselves, usually. No, they are nonplussed in all sincerity. The wall has for them something tranquilizing, morally soothing, final, maybe even something mysterious. But of the wall later. Well, Such a direct person I regard as the real normal man, as his tender Mother Nature wished to see him when she graciously brought him into being on the earth. I envy such a man till I am green in the face. He is stupid, I am not disputing that, but perhaps the normal man should be stupid. How do you know? Perhaps it is very beautiful, in fact, and I am all the more convinced of that suspicion, if one can call it so, by the fact that if, for instance, you take the antithesis of the normal man, that is the hyperconscious man, who has come, of course, not out of the lap of nature, but out of a retort. That is almost mysticism, gentlemen, but I suspect this too. This retort-made man is something so nonplussed in the presence of his antithesis that with all his hyperconsciousness he genuinely thinks of himself as a mouse and not a man. It may be a hyperconscious mouse, yet it is a mouse, while the other is a man, and therefore, etc. And the worst is, he himself, his very own self, looks upon himself as a mouse. No one asks him to do so, and that is the important point. Now let us look at this mouse in action. Let us suppose, for instance, that it feels insulted, too, and it almost always does feel insulted, and wants to revenge itself, too. There may even be a greater accumulation of spite in it than l'homme de la nature et de la vérité. The base, nasty desire to repay with spite whoever has offended it rankles perhaps even more nastily in it than l'homme de la nature et de la vérité. Perhaps, or because l'homme de la nature et de la vérité, through his innate stupidity, looks upon his revenge as justice, pure and simple. While in consequence of his hyperconsciousness, the mouse does not believe in the justice of it. To come at last to the deed itself, to the very act of revenge, apart from the one fundamental nastiness, the unfortunate mouse succeeds in creating around it so many other nastiness in the form of doubts and questions, adds to the one question so many unsettled questions, that there inevitably works up around it a sort of fatal brew. A stinking mess, made up of its doubts, agitations, and lastly of the contempt spat upon it by the straightforward men of action who stand solemnly about it as judges and arbitrators, laughing at it till their healthy sides ache. Of course, the only thing left for it is to dismiss all that with a wave of its paw, and with a smile of assured contempt in which it does not even believe itself, creep ignominiously back into its mouse hole. There, in its nasty, stinking underground, home, our insulted, crushed, and ridiculed mouse promptly becomes absorbed in cold, malignant, and above all, everlasting spite. For 40 years together, it will remember its injury down to the smallest, most shameful detail, and every time will add, of itself, details still more shameful, spitefully teasing and irritating itself with its own imagination. It will be ashamed of its own fancies, but yet it will recall everything. It will go over it again and again. It will invent lies against itself, pretending that those things might have happened, and will forgive nothing. Perhaps it will begin to revenge itself, too, but, as it were, piecemeal, in trivial ways, from behind the stove, incognito, without believing either in its own right to vengeance or in the success of its revenge, knowing beforehand that from all its efforts at revenge it will suffer 100 times more than he on whom it revenges itself. He probably will not even feel it. On its deathbed it will recall it all over again, with interest accumulated over all the years. But it is just in that cold, abominable half-despair, half-belief, in that conscious burying oneself alive for grief in the underworld for 40 years, in that hyper-consciousness and yet to some extent doubtful hopelessness of one's position, in that hell of unsatisfied desires turned inward, in that fever of oscillations, of resolutions taken forever and regretted again a minute later, that the savour of that strange enjoyment of which I have spoken lies. It is so subtle, sometimes so difficult to analyze consciously, that somewhat limited people, or simply people with strong nerves, will not understand anything at all in it. Possibly, you will add, on your own account with a grin, people who have never received a slap in the face will not understand it either. And in that way you will politely hint to me that I, too, perhaps, have been slapped in the face in my life, and so I speak as an expert. I bet you are thinking that. But set your minds at rest, gentlemen. I have not received a slap in the face. Though it doesn't matter to me at all what you may think about it. Possibly, I even myself regret that I have given so few slaps in the face during my life. But enough. Not another word on the subject of such extreme interest to you. I will continue calmly about people with strong nerves who do not understand a certain refinement of enjoyment. Though in certain circumstances these gentlemen bellow their loudest like bulls. Though this, let us suppose, does them the greatest honor, yet, as I have already said, confronted with the impossible, they at once resign themselves. Does the impossible mean the stone wall? What stone wall? Why, of course, the laws of nature, the conclusions of natural science, of mathematics. As soon as they prove to you, for instance, that they are descended from a monkey, then it is no use scowling. Accept it as a fact. When they prove to you that in reality 1 drop of your own fat must be dearer to you than 100,000 of your fellow creatures, and that this conclusion is the final solution of all so-called virtues and duties, of all such ravings and prejudices, then you might as well accept it. You can't do anything about it, because 2 times 2 is a law of mathematics. Just try refuting it. But really, they will shout at you. There is no use protesting. It is a case of 2 times 2 makes 4. Nature does not ask your permission, your wishes, and whether you like or dislike her laws does not concern her. You are bound to accept her as she is, and consequently also all her conclusions. A wall, you see, is a wall, etc., etc. Good God! But what do I care about the laws of nature and arithmetic, when, for some reason, I dislike those laws and the fact that 2 times 2 makes 4? Of course, I cannot break through a wall by battering my head against it if I really do not have enough strength to break through it. But I am not going to resign myself to it simply because it is a stone wall and I am not strong enough. As though such a wall really were a consolation, and really did contain some word of consolation, if only because it is as true as 2 times 2 makes 4. Oh, absurdity of absurdities! How much better is it to understand it all, to be conscious of it all the possibilities, and the stone walls, not to resign yourself to a single one of those impossibilities and stone walls if it disgusts you to resign yourself, to reach through the most inevitable logical combinations, the most revolting conclusion on the everlasting theme that you are yourself somehow to blame, even for the stone wall, though again it is as clear as day that you are not to blame in the least, and therefore grinding your teeth in silent impotence sensuously to sink into inertia, brooding on the fact that it turns out that there is even no one for you to feel vindictive against, that you have not, and perhaps never will, have an object for your spite, that it is a sleight of hand, a bit of juggling, a card sharper's trick, that it is simply a mess, no knowing what and no knowing who, and in spite of all the uncertainties and jugglings, still there is an ache in you, and the more you do not know, the worse the ache. Chapter 4 of Dostoyevsky. Ha ha ha! Next you will find enjoyment in the toothache, you cry with a laugh. Well, so what? There is enjoyment even in the toothache, I answer. I had a toothache for a whole month, and I know there is. In that case, of course, people are not spiteful in silence. They moan. But these are not sincere moans. They are malicious moans. They are maliciousness, and the maliciousness is the whole point. The sufferer's enjoyment finds expression in these moans. If he did not feel enjoyment in them, he would not moan. It is a good example, gentlemen, and I will develop it. The moans express in the first place all the aimlessness of your pain, which is so humiliating to your consciousness. The whole legal system of nature on which you spit disdainfully, of course, but from which you suffer all the same while she does not. They express the consciousness that you have no enemy, but that you do have pain. The consciousness that in spite of all the dentists in the world, you are in complete slavery to your teeth. That if someone wishes it, your teeth will leave off aching, and if he does not, they will go on aching another 3 months. And that, finally, if you still disagree and still protest, all that is left for you, for your own gratification, is to thrash yourself or beat your wall with your fist as hard as you can, and absolutely nothing more. Well, then, these mortal insults, these jeers on the part of someone unknown, end at last in the enjoyment which sometimes reaches the highest degree of sensuality. I beg you, gentlemen, to listen sometimes to the moan of an educated man in the 19th century who is suffering from a toothache, particularly on the 2nd or 3rd day of the attack, when he has already begun to moan, not as he moaned on the 1st day, that is, not simply because he has a toothache, not just as any coarse peasant might moan, but as a man affected by progress and European civilization. A man who is divorced from the soil and the national principles, as they call it in these days. His moans become nasty, disgustingly spiteful, and go on for whole days and nights. And after all, he himself knows that he does not benefit at all from his moans. He knows better than anyone that he is only lacerating and irritating himself and others in vain. He knows that even the audience for whom he is exerting himself and his whole family now listen to him with loathing, do not believe him for a second, and that deep down they understand that he could moan differently, more simply, without trills and flourishes, and that he is only indulging himself like that out of spite, out of malice. Well, sensuality exists precisely in all these consciousnesses and infamies. It seems I am troubling you. I am lacerating your hearts. I am keeping everyone in the house awake. Well, stay awake, then. You, too, feel every minute that I have a toothache. I am no longer the hero to you now that I tried to appear before, but simply a nasty person, a scoundrel. Well, let it be that way, then. I am very glad that you see through me. Is it nasty for you to hear my foul moans? Well, let it be nasty. Here, I will let you have an even nastier flourish in a minute. You still do not understand, gentlemen? No, it seems our development in our consciousness must go further to understand all the intricacies of this sensuality. You laugh. I am delighted. My jokes, gentlemen, are of course in bad taste, uneven, involved, lacking self-confidence. But of course, that is because I do not respect myself. Can a man with consciousness respect himself at all? Chapter 5 of Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. Come, can a man who even attempts to find enjoyment in the very feeling of self-degradation really have any respect for himself at all? I am not saying this now from any insipid kind of remorse. And indeed, I could never endure to say, "Forgive me, Daddy, I won't do it again." Not because I was incapable of saying it, but on the contrary, perhaps just because I was too capable of saying it. And in what a way, too, as though on purpose I used to get into trouble on occasions when I was not to blame in the faintest way. That was the nastiest part of it. At the same time, I was genuinely touched and repentant. I used to shed tears and, of course, tricked even myself, though it was not acting in the least. And there was a sick feeling in my heart at the time. For that one could not even blame the laws of nature, though the laws of nature have offended me continually all my life, more than anything. It is loathsome to remember it all, but it was loathsome even then. Of course, in a minute or so I would realize with spite that it was all a lie, an affected, revolting lie. That is, all this repentance, all these emotions, these vows to reform. And if you ask why I worried and tortured myself that way, the answer because it was very dull to twiddle one's thumbs, and so one began cutting capers. That is really it. Observe yourself more carefully, gentlemen. Then you will understand that that's right. I invented adventures for myself and made up a life so as to live at least in some way. How many times had it happened to me? Well, for instance, to take offense at nothing, simply on purpose. And one knows oneself, of course, that one is offended at nothing, that one is pretending, and yet one brings oneself at last to the point of really being offended. All my life I have had an impulse to play such pranks, so that in the end I could not control it in myself. Another time, twice, in fact, I tried to force myself to fall in love. I even suffered, gentlemen, I assure you. In the depths of my heart, I did not believe in my suffering. There was a stir of mockery. But yet I did suffer, and in a real, regular way. I was jealous. I was beside myself, and it was all out of boredom, gentlemen, all out of boredom. Inertia overcame me. After all, the direct, legitimate, immediate fruit of consciousness is inertia. That is, conscious thumb twiddling. I have referred to it already. I repeat it emphatically. All straightforward persons and men of action are active just because they are stupid and limited. How can that be explained? This way. As a result of their limitations, they take immediate and secondary causes for primary ones, and that in that way persuade themselves more quickly and easily than other people do that they have found an infallible basis for their activity, and their minds are at ease, and that, you know, is the most important thing. To begin to act, you know, you must first have your mind completely at ease and without a trace of doubt left in it. Well, how am I, for example, to set my mind at rest? Where are the primary causes on which I am to build? Where are my bases? Where am I to get them from? I exert myself in the process of thinking, and consequently with my every primary cause at once draws after itself another, still more primary, and so on to infinity. That is precisely the essence of every sort of consciousness and thinking. It must be a case of the laws of nature again. And what does it finally result? Why, just the same. Remember I spoke just now of vengeance? I am sure you did not grasp that. I said that a man revenges himself because he finds justice in it. Therefore, he has found a primary cause, found a basis, to wit, justice. And so he is completely set at rest. And consequently, he carries out his revenge calmly and successfully, as he is convinced that he is doing a just, an honest thing. But after all, I see no justice in it. I find no sort of virtue in it either, and consequently, if I attempt to revenge myself, it would only be out of spite. Spite, of course, might overcome everything, all my doubts, and could consequently serve quite successfully in a place of a primary cause, precisely because it is not a cause. But what can be done if I do not even have spite? After all, I began with that just now. Again, in consequence of those accursed laws of consciousness, my spite is subject to chemical disintegration. You look into it. An object flies into the air. Your reasons evaporate. The criminal is not to be found. The insult becomes fate rather than an insult, something like a toothache, for which no one is to blame. And consequently, there is only the same outlet left again, that is, to beat the wall as hard as you can. So you give it up as hopeless because you have not found a fundamental cause. And try letting yourself be carried away by your feelings, blindly, without reflection, without a primary cause, repelling consciousness at least for a time, hate or love, if only not to sit and twiddle your thumbs. The day after tomorrow, at the latest, you will begin despising yourself for having knowingly deceived yourself. The result, a soap bubble of inertia. Oh, gentlemen, after all, perhaps I consider myself an intelligent man only because all my life I have been able neither to begin nor to finish anything. Granted, I am a babbler, a harmless, annoying babbler, like all of us. But what is to be done if the direct and sole vocation of every intelligent man is babble? That is, the intentional pouring of water through a sieve. Chapter 6 of Dostoyevsky's Note from Underground. Excuse me. Oh, if I had done nothing simply out of laziness. Heavens, how I could have respected myself then. I would have respected myself because I would at least have been capable of being lazy. There would at least have been in me one positive quality, as it were, in which I could have believed myself. Question, who is he? Answer, a loafer. After all, it would have been pleasant to hear that about oneself. It would mean that I was positively defined. It would mean that there was something to be said about me. Loafer. Why, after all, it is a calling and an appointment. It is a career, gentlemen. Do not joke. It is so. I would then, by rights, be a member of the best club, and would occupy myself only in continually respecting myself. I knew a gentleman who prided himself all on life on being a connoisseur of Lafitte. He considered this as his positive virtue, and never doubted himself. He died, not simply with a tranquil, but with a triumphant conscience. And he was completely right. I should have chosen a career for myself then, too. I would have been a loafer and a glutton, not a simple one, but, for instance, one in sympathy with everything good and beautiful. How do you like that? I have long had visions of it. That sublime and beautiful weighs heavily on my mind at 40. But that is when I am 40. Well, then it would have been different. I would have found myself an appropriate occupation, namely to drink to the health of everything sublime and beautiful. I would have seized every opportunity to drop a tear into my glass and then to drain it to all the sublime and beautiful. I would then have turned everything into the sublime and beautiful. I would have sought out the sublime and the beautiful in the nastiest, most unquestionable trash. I would have become as tearful as a wet sponge. An artist, for instance, paints 𝐔𝐧𝐝𝐞𝐫𝐠𝐫𝐶 picture. At once I drink to the health of that artist who painted 𝐔𝐧𝐝𝐶 picture, because I love all that is sublime and beautiful. An author writes, whatever you like. At once I drink to the health of whatever you like, because I love all that is sublime and beautiful. I would demand respect for doing so. I would persecute anyone who would not show me respect. I would live at ease. I would die triumphantly. Why, after all, it is charming, perfectly charming, and what a belly I would have grown, what a triple chin I would have established, what a red nose I would have produced for myself, so that every passer-by would have said, looking at me, here is an asset, here is something really positive. And after all, say what you like, it is very pleasant to hear such remarks about oneself in this negative age, gentlemen. Chapter 7 of Part 1 of Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. But these are all golden dreams. Oh, tell me, who first declared, who first proclaimed that man only does nasty things because he does not know his own real interests, and that if he were enlightened, if his eyes were open to his real normal interests, man would at once cease to do nasty things, would at once become good and noble, because, being enlightened and understanding his real advantage, he would see his own advantage in the good and nothing else. And we all know that not a single man can knowingly act to his own disadvantage. Consequently, so to say, he would begin doing good through necessity. Ah, the babe! Oh, the pure, innocent child! Why, in the first place, when all these thousands of years, has there ever been a time when man has acted only for his own advantage? What is to be done with the millions of facts that bear witness that man, knowingly, that is, fully understanding their real advantages, have left them in the background and have rushed headlong on another path, to risk, to chance, compelled to this course by nobody and by nothing, but, as it were, precisely because they did not want the beaten track, and stubbornly, willfully, went off on another difficult, absurd way of seeking it almost in the darkness? After all, it means that this stubbornness and willingness were more pleasant to them than any advantage. Advantage! What is advantage? And will you take it upon yourself to define with perfect accuracy and exactly what the advantage of man consists of? And what if so? What if it so happens that a man's advantage sometimes not only may, but even must consist exactly in his desiring under certain conditions what is harmful to himself and not what is advantageous? And if so, if there can be such a condition when the whole principle becomes worthless, what do you think? Are there such cases? You laugh away, gentlemen, so long as you answer me. Have man's advantage has been calculated with perfect certainty? Are there not some which not only have been included, but cannot possibly be included under any classification? After all, you, gentlemen, so far as I know, have taken your whole register of human advantages from the average of statistical figures and scientific economic formulas. After all, your advantages are prosperity, wealth, freedom, peace, and so on and so on. So that a man who, for instance, would openly and knowingly oppose that whole list would, to your thinking, and indeed to mine too, of course, be an obscurantist or an absolute madman, would he not? But after all, here is something amazing. Why does it happen that all these statisticians, sages, and lovers of humanity, when they calculate human advantage, invariably leave one out? They don't even take it into their calculations in the form in which it should be taken, and the whole reckoning depends upon that. There would be no great harm to take it, this advantage, and to add it to the list. But the trouble is that this strange advantage does not fall under any classification and does not figure in any list. For instance, I have a friend, gentlemen, but after all, he is your friend too, and indeed there is no one to whom he is not a friend. When he prepares for any undertaking, this gentleman immediately explains to you, pompously and clearly, exactly how he must act in accordance with the laws of reason and truth. What is more, he will talk to you with excitement and passion of the real normal interests of man. With irony, he will reproach the short-sighted fools who do not understand their own advantage for the true significance of virtue. And within a quarter of an hour, without any sudden outside provocation, but precisely through that something internal which is stronger than all his advantages, he will go off on quite a different track. That is, act directly opposite to what he has just been saying himself, in opposition to the laws of reason, in opposition to his own advantage, in fact, in opposition to everything. I warn you that my friend is a compound personality, and therefore it is somehow difficult to blame him as an individual. The fact is, gentlemen, it seems that something that is dearer to almost every man than his greatest advantage must really exist. Or, not to be illogical, there is one most advantageous advantage, the very one omitted of which we just spoke now, which is more important and more advantageous than all other advantages, for which, if necessary, a man is ready to act in opposition to all laws, that is, in opposition to reason, honor, peace, prosperity, in short, in opposition to all those wonderful and useful things, if only he can attain that fundamental, most advantageous advantage, which is dearer to him than all. Well, but it is still advantage just the same, you will retort. But excuse me, I'll make my point clear, and it is not a case of a play on words, but what really matters is that this advantage is remarkable from the very fact that it breaks down all our classifications, and continually shatters all the systems evolved by lovers of mankind for the happiness of mankind. In short, it interferes with everything. But before I mention this advantage to you, I want to compromise myself personally. And therefore, I boldly decree that all these fine systems, all these theories for explaining to mankind its real normal interests, so that, inevitably striving to obtain these interests, it may at once become good and noble, are, in my opinion, so far, mere logical exercises. Yes, logical exercises. After all, to maintain even this theory of the regeneration of mankind by means of its own advantage is, after all, to my mind, almost the same thing as to claim, for instance, with Buckle that through civilization mankind became softer, and consequently less bloodthirsty, and less fitted for warfare. Logically, it does not seem to follow from his arguments. But man is so fond of systems and abstract deductions that he is ready to distort the truth intentionally. He is ready to deny that he can see and hear just to justify his logic. I take this example because it is the most glaring instance of it. Only look about you. Blood is being spilled in streams, and in the merriest way, as though it were champagne. Take the whole of the 19th century in which Buckle lived. Take Napoleon, both the great and the present one. Take North America, the Eternal Union. Take farcical 𝐔𝐧𝐝𝐿. And what is it that civilization softens in us? Civilization only produces a greater variety of sensations in man, and absolutely nothing more. And through the development of this variety, man may even come to find enjoyments in bloodshed. After all, it has already happened to him. Have you noticed that the subtlest slaughterers have always been the most civilized gentlemen, to whom the various Attilas and Stenka-Ratzins could never hold a candle? And if they are not so conspicuous as the Attilas and Stenka-Ratzins, it is precisely because they are so often met with, are so ordinary, and have become so familiar to us. In any case, if civilization has not made men more bloodthirsty, it has at least made him more abominable, more loathsomely bloodthirsty than before. Formerly, he saw justice in bloodshed, and with his conscience at peace exterminated whoever he thought he should. And now, while we consider bloodshed an abomination, we nevertheless engage in this abomination, and even more than ever before. Which is worse? Decide that for yourselves. It is said that Cleopatra, pardon the example from Roman history, was fond of sticking gold pins into her slave girls' breasts, and derived enjoyment from their screams and writhing. You will say, but that occurred in comparatively barbarous times. But these are barbarous times too, because, also comparatively speaking, pins are stuck in even now. That even though man has now learned to see more clearly, occasionally, than in barbarous times, he is still far from having accustomed himself to act as reason and science would dictate, but all the time you are fully convinced that he will inevitably accustom himself to it when he gets completely rid of certain old bad habits. And when common sense and science have completely re-educated human nature and turned it in its normal direction, you are confident that men will then refrain from erring intentionally, and will, so to say, willy-nilly, not want to set his will against his normal interests. More than that, then, you say, science itself will teach man, though to my mind that is a luxury. That he does not really have either caprice or will of his own, and that he has never had it, and that he himself is something like a piano key or an organ stop, and that, moreover, laws of nature exist in this world, so that everything he does is not done by his will at all, but is done by itself, according to the laws of nature. Consequently, we have only to discover these laws of nature, and man will no longer be responsible for his actions, and life will become exceedingly easy for him. All human actions will then, of course, be tabulated according to these laws, mathematically, like tables of algorithms up to 108,000, and entered in a table, or better still, there would be published certain edifying works, like the present encyclopedic lexicons, in which everything will be so clearly calculated and designated that there will be no more incidents or adventures in the world. Then it is still you speaking. New economic relations will be established, already made and computed with mathematical exactitude, so that every possible question will vanish in a twinkling, simply because every possible answer to it will be provided. Then the Crystal Palace will be built. Then, well, in short, those will be halcyon days. Of course, there is no guaranteeing, this is my comment now, that it will not be, for instance, terribly boring then. For what will one have to do when everything is calculated according to the table? But on the other hand, everything will be extraordinarily rational. Of course, boredom may lead you to do anything. After all, boredom even sets one to sticking gold pins into people. But all that would not matter. What is bad, this is my comment again, is that for all I know, people will be thankful for the gold pins in them. After all, man is stupid, phenomenally stupid. Or rather, he is not stupid at all, but he is so ungrateful that you could not find another like him in all creation. After all, it would not surprise me in the least if, for instance, suddenly, for no reason at all, general rationalism in the midst of the future, a gentleman with an ignoble, or rather with a reactionary and ironical countenance were to arise and, putting his arms akimbo, say to us all, "What do you think, gentlemen? Hadn't we better stick over all that rationalism at one blow, scatter it to the winds, just to send these logarithms to the devil, and to let us live once more according to our own foolish will?" That again would not matter, for what is annoying is that after all he would be sure to find followers. Such is the nature of man. And after that, for the most foolish reasons, which one would think was hardly worth mentioning. That is, that every man everywhere, and that is, that every man everywhere and always, whoever he may be, has preferred to act as he wished, and not in the least to his reason and advantage dictated, Why, one may choose what is contrary to one's own interests, and sometimes one positively ought. That is my idea. One's own free, unfettered choice, one's own fancy, however wild it may be, one's own fancy worked up at times to frenzy, why, that is the very most advantageous advantage which we have overlooked, which comes under no classification, and through which all other systems and theories are continually being sent to the devil. And how do these sages know that man must necessarily need a rationally advantageous choice? What man needs is simply independent choice, whatever that independence may cost, and wherever it may lead. Well, choice, after all, the devil knows. Chapter 8 of Part 1 of Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. Well, after all, if you like, in reality, there is no such thing as choice. You will interrupt with a laugh. Science has even now succeeded in analyzing man to such an extent that we know already that choice and what is called freedom of will are nothing other than... Wait, gentlemen, I mean to begin with that myself. I admit that I was even frightened. I was just going to shout that after all the devil only knows what choice depends on, and that perhaps that was a very good thing, but I remembered the teaching of science and pulled myself up. And here you have begun to speak. After all, really, well, if some day they truly discover a formula for all our desires and caprices, that is an explanation of what they depend upon, by what laws they arise, just how they develop, what they are aiming at in one case or another, and so on and so on. That is a real mathematical formula. Then, after all, man would most likely at once stop to feel desire. Indeed, he would be uncertain to. For who would want to choose by rule? Besides, we will at once be transformed from a human being into an organ stop or something of that sort. For what is a man without desire, without free will, and without choice, if not a stop in an organ? What do you think? Let us consider the possibility. Can such a thing happen or not? You decide. Our choice is usually mistaken through a mistaken notion of our advantage. We sometimes choose absolute nonsense because in our stupidity we see that nonsense is an easier means for attaining an advantage assumed beforehand. But when all that is explained and worked out on paper, which is perfectly possible, for it is contemptible and senseless to assume an advantage that man will never understand some laws of nature, then of course so-called desires will not exist. After all, if desire should at any time come to terms completely with reason, we shall then, of course, reason and not desire. Simply because, after all, it will be impossible to retain reason and desire something senseless, and in that way knowingly act against reason and desire to injure ourselves. And as all choice and reason can really be calculated, because someday they will discover the laws of our so-called free will, so, joking aside, there may one day probably be something like a table of desires, so that we really shall choose in accordance with it. After all, if, for instance, someday they calculate and prove to me that I stuck my tongue out at someone because I could not help sticking my tongue out at him, and that I had to do it in that particular way, what sort of freedom is left me, especially if I am a learned man and have taken my degree somewhere? After all, then I would be able to calculate my whole life for 30 years in advance. In short, if that comes about, then, after all, we could do nothing about it. Well, we would have to accept it just the same. And in fact, we ought to repeat to ourselves incessantly that at such and such a time and under such and such circumstances, nature does not ask our leave, that we must accept her as she is, and not as we imagine her to be. And if we really aspire to tables and indices and, well, even... well, let us say to the chemical retort that it cannot be helped. We must accept the retort too, or else it will be accepted without our consent. Yes, but here I come to a stop. Gentlemen, you must excuse me for philosophizing. It is the result of 40 years underground. Allow me to indulge my fancy for a minute. You see, gentlemen, reason, gentlemen, is an excellent thing. There is no disputing that. But reason is only reason and can only satisfy man's rational faculty. While will is a manifestation of all life, that is, of all human life, including reason as well as all impulses. And although our life, in this manifestation of it, is often worthless, yet it is life nonetheless, and not simply extracting square roots. After all, here I, for instance, quite naturally want to live in order to satisfy all my faculties for life, and not simply my rational faculty. That is, not simply 1/20th of all my faculties for life. What does reason know? Reason only knows what it has succeeded in learning. Some things it will perhaps never learn. Well, this is nevertheless no comfort. Why not say so frankly? And human nature acts as a whole, with everything that is in it, consciously or unconsciously, and even if it goes wrong, it lives. I suspect, gentlemen, that you are looking at me with compassion. You repeat to me that an enlightened and developed man, such, in short, as the future man will be, cannot knowingly desire anything disadvantageous to himself. That this can be proved mathematically. I thoroughly agree. It really can, by mathematics. And I repeat for the 100th time, there is one case, one only, when man may purposely, consciously desire what is injurious to himself, what is stupid, very stupid, simply in order to have the right to desire for himself even what is very stupid, and not to be bound by an obligation to desire only what is rational. After all, this very stupid thing, after all, this caprice of ours, may really be more advantageous for us, gentlemen, than anything else on earth, especially in some cases. And, and in particular, it may be more advantageous than any advantages, even when it does us obvious harm, and contradicts the soundest conclusions of our reason about our advantage, because in any case it preserves for us what is most precious and most important, that is, our personality, our individuality. Some, you see, maintain that this really is the most precious thing for man. Desire can, of course, if it desires, be in agreement with reason, particularly if it does not abuse this practice, but does so in moderation. It is both useful and sometimes even praiseworthy. But very often, and even most often, desire completely and stubbornly opposes reason, and you know that too is useful and sometimes even praiseworthy. Gentlemen, let us suppose that man is not stupid. Indeed, after all, one cannot say that about him anyway, if even for the one consideration that if man is stupid, then after all, who is wise? But if he is not stupid, he is just the same, monstrously ungrateful, phenomenally ungrateful. I even believe that the best definition of man is a creature that walks on 2 legs and is ungrateful. But that is not all. That is not his worst defect. His worst defect is his perpetual immortality, perpetual from the days of the flood to the 𝐔𝐧𝐝𝐞𝐫𝐠𝐫𝐶 period of human destiny. Immortality, and consequently lack of good sense, for it has long been accepted that lack of good sense is due to no other cause than immortality. Try it, and cast a look upon history of mankind. Well, what do you see? Is it a grand spectacle? All right, grand if you like. The Colossus of Rhodes, for instance, that is worth something. Mr. Dostoyevsky may well testify that some may say it is the work of human hands, while others maintain that it was created by nature herself. Is it variegated? Very well, it may be variegated too. If one only took the dress uniforms, military and civilian, of all peoples and all ages, that alone is worth something, and if you take the undress uniforms, you will never get to the end of it. No historian could keep up with it. Is it monotonous? Very well. It may be monotonous too. They fight and fight. They are fighting now. They fought first, and they fight last. You will admit that it is almost too monotonous. In short, one may say anything about the history of the world, anything that might enter the most disordered imagination, but the only thing one cannot say is that it is rational. The very word sticks in one's throat. And indeed, this is even the kind of thing that continually happens. After all, there are continually turning up in life moral and rational people, sages and lovers of humanity, who make it their goal for life to live as morally and rationally as possible, to be, so to speak, a light to their neighbors, simply in order to show them that it is really possible to live morally and rationally in this world. And so what? We all know that those very people, sooner or later, toward the end of their lives, have been false to themselves, playing some trick, often the most indecent one. Now I ask you, what can one expect from man, since he is a creature endowed with such strange qualities? Shower upon him every earthly blessing, drown him in bliss, so that nothing but bubbles would dance on the surface of his bliss, as on a sea. Give him such economic prosperity that he would have nothing else to do but sleep, eat cakes, and busy himself with ensuring the continuation of world history, and even then man, out of sheer ingratitude, sheer libel, would play you some loathsome trick. He would even risk his cakes, and would deliberately desire the most fatal rubbish, the most uneconomical absurdity, simply to introduce into all this positive rationality his fatal, fantastic element. It is just his fantastic dreams, his vulgar follies, that he will desire to retain, simply in order to prove to himself, as though that were necessary, that men still are men and not piano keys, which, even if played by the laws of nature themselves, threaten to be controlled so completely that soon one will be able to desire nothing but by the calendar. And after all, that is not all. Even if man really were nothing but a piano key, even if this were proved to him by natural science and mathematics, even then he would not become reasonable, but would purposely do something perverse out of sheer ingratitude, simply to have his own way. And if he does not find any means, he will devise destruction and chaos, will devise suffering of all sorts, and will thereby have his own way. He will launch a curse upon the world, and as only man can curse, it is his privilege and primary distinction between him and other animals, then, after all, perhaps only by his curse will he obtain his object, that is, really convince himself that he is a man and not a piano key. If you say that all this too can be calculated and tabulated, chaos and darkness and curses, so that the mere possibility of calculating it all beforehand would stop it all, and reason would reassert himself, then man would purposely go mad in order to be rid of reason and have his own way. I believe in that. I vouch for it. Because, after all, the whole work of man seems really to consist in nothing but proving to himself continually that he is a man and not an organ stop. It may be at the cost of his skin, but he has proved it. He may become a caveman, but he will have proved it. And after that, can one help sinning, rejoicing that it has not yet come, and that desire still depends on the devil knows what? You will shout at me, that is, if you still favor me with your shout, that, after all, no one is depriving me of my will, that all they are concerned with is that my will should somehow of itself, of its own free will, coincide with my own normal interests, with the laws of nature and arithmetic. That, gentlemen, what sort of free will is left when we come to tables and arithmetic, when it will all be a case of 2 times 2 makes 4? 2 times 2 makes 4 even without my will, as if free will meant that. Right. Chapter 9 of Part 1, Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. Gentlemen, I am joking, of course, and I know myself that I am joking badly. But after all, you know, one can't take everything as a joke. I am perhaps joking with a heavy heart. Gentlemen, I am tormented by questions. Answer them for me. Now, you, for instance, want to cure men of their old habits and reform their will in accordance with science and common sense. But how do you know, not only that it is possible, but also that it is desirable to reform man in that way? And what leads you to the conclusion that it is so necessary to reform man's desire? In short, how do you know that such a reformation will really be advantageous to man? And to go to the heart of the matter, why are you so sure of your conviction that not to act against his real normal advantages, guaranteed by the conclusions of reason and arithmetic, is always advantageous for men, and must be a law for all mankind? After all, up to now, it is only your supposition. Let us suppose it to be a law of logic, but perhaps not a law of humanity at all. You, gentlemen, perhaps think that I am mad? Allow me to defend myself. I agree that man is preemptively a creative animal, predestined to strive consciously toward a goal, and to engage in engineering, that is, eternally and incessantly, to build new roads, wherever they may lead. But the reason why he sometimes wants to swerve aside may be precisely that he is forced to make that road, and perhaps, too, because however stupid the straightforward practical man may be in general, the thought nevertheless will sometimes occur to him that the road, it would seem, almost always does lead somewhere, and that the destination it leads to is less important than the process of making it, and that the chief thing is to save the well-behaved child from despising engineering, and so giving way to the fatal idleness, which, as we all know, is the mother of all vices. Man likes to create and build roads. That is beyond dispute. But why does he also have such a passionate love for destruction and chaos? Now tell me that. But on that point, I want to say a few special words myself. May it not be that he loves chaos and destruction? After all, he sometimes unquestionably likes it very much. That is surely so. Because he is instinctively afraid of attaining his goal and completing the edifice he is constructing? How do you know? Perhaps he only likes that edifice from a distance, and not at all at close range. Perhaps he only likes to build and does not want to live in it, but will leave it when completed. All animaux domestiques. such as the ants, the sheep, and so on and so on. Now, the ants have quite a different taste. They have an amazing edifice of that type that endures forever. The anthill. With the anthill, the respectable race of ants began. And with the anthill, they will probably end, which does the greatest credit to their perseverance and steadiness. But man is a frivolous and incongruous creature, and perhaps, like the chess player, loves only the process of the game, not the end of it. And who knows? One cannot swear to it. Perhaps the only goal on earth is, well, to which mankind is striving lies in his incessant process of attaining, or in other words, in life itself, and not particularly in the goal, which of course must always be 2 times 2 makes 4. That is a formula. That is a formula, and after all, 2 times 2 makes 4 is no longer life, gentlemen, but is the beginning of death. Anyway, man has always been somehow afraid of this 2 times 2 makes 4, and I'm afraid of it even now. Granted that man does nothing but seek that 2 times 2 makes 4, but to succeed, really, to find it, he is somehow afraid, I assure you. He feels that as soon as he has found it, there will be nothing for him to look for. When workmen have finished their work, they at least receive their pay. They go to the tavern, then they wind up at the police station. And there is an occupation for a week. But where can man go? Anyway, one can observe a certain awkwardness about him every time he attains such goals. He likes the process of attaining, but does not quite like to have attained. And that, of course, is terribly funny. Of course, man is a comical creature. There seems to be a kind of pun in it all, but 2 times 2 makes 4 is, after all, something insufferable. 2 times 2 makes 4 seems to me simply a piece of insolence. 2 times 2 makes 4 is a fop standing with arms akimbo, bearing your path and spitting. I admit that 2 times 2 makes 4 is an excellent thing, but if we are going to praise everything, 2 times 2 makes 5 is sometimes also a very charming little thing. And why are you so firmly, so triumphantly convinced that only the normal and the positive, in short, only prosperity, is to the advantage of man? Is not reason mistaken about advantage? After all, perhaps man likes something besides prosperity. Perhaps he likes suffering just as much. Perhaps suffering is just as great an advantage to him as prosperity. Man is sometimes fearfully, passionately in love with suffering, and that is a fact. There is no need to appeal to universal history to prove that. Only ask yourself. If only you are a man and have lived at all. As far as my own personal opinion is concerned, to care only for prosperity seems to me somehow even ill-bred. Whether it's good or bad, it is sometimes very pleasant to smash things too. After all, I do not really insist on sufferings or on prosperity either. I insist on my caprice, and its being guaranteed to me when necessary. Suffering would be out of place in vaudevilles, for instance, I know that. In the Crystal Palace, it is not even unthinkable. Suffering means doubt. Oh, I'm sorry. It read, in the Crystal Palace, in the Crystal Palace, it is even unthinkable. Suffering means doubt, means negation. And what would be the good of a Crystal Palace if there could be any doubt about it? And yet I am sure man will never renounce real suffering, that is, destruction and chaos. Why, after all, suffering is the sole origin of consciousness. Though I stated at the beginning that consciousness is, in my opinion, the greatest misfortune for man. Yet I know man loves it and would not give it up for any satisfaction. Consciousness, for instance, is infinitely superior to 2 times 2 makes 4. Once you have 2 times 2 makes 4, there is nothing left to do or to understand. There will be nothing left but to bottle up your 5 senses and plunge into contemplation. While, if you stick to consciousness, even though you attain the same result, you can at least flog yourself at times, and that will, at any rate, liven you up. It may be reactionary, but corporal punishment is still better than nothing. Chapter 10, Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. You believe in a crystal edifice that can never be destroyed. That is, in an edifice at which one would neither be able to stick out one's tongue nor thumb one's nose on the sly. And perhaps I am afraid of this edifice just because it is of crystal and can never be destroyed, and that one could not even put out one's tongue at it even on the sly. You see, if it were not a palace, but a chicken coop, and rain started, I might creep into the chicken coop to avoid getting wet, and yet I would not call the chicken coop a palace out of gratitude to it for sheltering me from the rain. You laugh. You even say that in such circumstances a chicken coop is as good as a mansion. Yet, yes, I answer, if one had to live simply to avoid getting wet. But what is to be done if I have taken it into my head that this is not the only object in life, and that if one must live, one may as well live in a mansion? That is my choice, my desire. You will only eradicate it when you have changed my desire. Well, do change it. Tempt me with something else. Give me another ideal. But in the meantime, I will not take a chicken coop for a palace. Let the crystal edifice even be an idle dream. Say it is inconsistent with the laws of nature, and that I have invented it only through my own stupidity, through some old-fashioned irrational habits of my generation. But what do I care if it is inconsistent? Does it matter at all, since it exists in my desire, or rather exists as long as my desires exist? Perhaps you are laughing again. Laugh away. I will put up with all your laughter, rather than pretend that I am satisfied when I am hungry. I know, anyway, that I will not be appeased with a compromise, with an endlessly reoccurring 0. Simply because it is inconsistent with the laws of nature and really exists. I will not accept as a crown of my desires a block of buildings with apartments for the poor on a lease of 1,000 years, and to take care of any contingency, a dentist's shingle hanging out. Destroy my desires, eradicate my ideals, show me something better, and I will follow you. You may say, perhaps, that it is not worth your getting involved in it. But in that case, after all, I can give you the same answer. We are discussing things seriously, but if you won't deign to give me your attention, then, after all, I won't speak to you. I do have my underground. But while I am still alive and have desires, I would rather my hand were withered than let it bring one brick to such a building. Don't remind me that I have just rejected the crystal edifice for the sole reason that one cannot put out one's tongue at it. I did not say it at all because I am so fond of putting my tongue out. Perhaps the only thing I resented was that of all your edifices up to now, there has not been a single one at which one could not put out one's tongue. On the contrary, I would let my tongue be cut out of sheer gratitude if things could be so arranged that I myself would lose all desire to put it out. What do I care that things cannot be so arranged? And that one must be satisfied with model apartments. Why, then, am I made with such desires? Can I have been made simply in order to come to the conclusion that the whole way I am made is a swindle? Can this be my whole purpose? I do not believe it. But do you know what? I am convinced that we underground folk ought to be kept in tow. Though we may be able to sit underground 40 years without speaking, when we do come out into the light of day and break out, we talk and talk and talk. Excuse me. Part 1 of Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground, Chapter 11. Excuse me. The long and the short of it is, gentlemen, that it is so better to do nothing. Better conscious inertia, and so hurrah for the underground. Though I have said that I envy every normal man to the point of exasperation, yet I would not care to be in his place as he is now, though I will not stop envying him. No, anyway, the underground life is more advantageous. There, at any rate, one can... But after all, even now I am lying because I know myself as surely as 2 times 2 makes 4, that it is not at all underground that is better, but something different, quite different, for which I belong, but which I cannot find. Damn underground. I will tell you another thing that would be better, and that is, if I myself believed even an iota of what I have just written. I swear to you, gentlemen, that I do not really believe one thing, not even one word of what I have just written. That is, I believe it, perhaps, but at the same time, I feel and suspect that I am lying myself blue in the face. Then why have you written it? You will say to me. I ought to put you in the underground 40 years without anything to do, and then come to you to find out what stage you have reached. How can a man be left alone with nothing to do for 40 years? Isn't that shameful? Isn't that humiliating? You will say, perhaps shaking your head contemptuously. You long for life, and try to settle the problems of life by a logical tangle. And how tiresome, how insolent your outbursts are, and at the same time, how scared you are. You talk nonsense and are pleased with it. You say impudent things and are constantly afraid of them and apologizing for them. You declare that you are afraid of nothing, and at the same time try to ingratiate yourself with us. You declare that you are gnashing your teeth, and at the same time you try to be witty so as to amuse us. You know that your witticisms are not witty, but you are evidently well satisfied with their literary value. You may perhaps really have suffered, but you have no respect whatsoever for your own suffering. You may be truthful in what you have said, but you have no modesty. Out of the pettiest vanity you bring your truth to public exposure, to the marketplace, to ignominy. You doubtlessly mean to say something, but hide your real meaning for fear, because you lack the resolution to say it, and have only a cowardly impudence. You boast of consciousness, but you are unsure of your ground. For though your mind works, yet your heart is corrupted by depravity, and you cannot have a full, genuine consciousness without a pure heart. And how tiresome you are! How you thrust yourself on people and grimace. Lies, lies, lies. Of course, I myself have made up just now all these things you say. That, too, is from underground. For 40 years I have been listening to your words through cracks under the floor. I have invented them myself. After all, there was nothing else I could invent. It is no wonder that I have learned them by heart, and that it has taken a literary form. But can you really be so credulous as to think that I will print all this and give it to you to read? And another problem, why do I really call you gentlemen? Why do I address you as though you really are my readers? Such declarations I invent to myself are never printed, nor given to other people to read. Anyway, I am not strong-minded enough for that, and I don't see why I should be. But, you see, a fancy has occurred to me, and I want to fulfill it at all costs. Let me explain. Every man has some reminiscence which he would not tell to anyone, but only to friends. He has others which he would not reveal even to his friends, but only to himself, and that in secret. But finally, there are still others which a man is even afraid to tell himself, and every decent man has a considerable number of such things stored away. That is, one can even say that the more decent he is, the greater the number of such things in his mind. Anyway, I have only lately decided to remember some of my early adventures. Till now, I have always avoided them, even with a certain uneasiness. Now, however, when I am not only recalling them, but have actually decided to write them down, I want to try the experiment whether one can be perfectly frank, even with oneself, and not take fright at the whole truth. I will observe, parenthetically, that Heine maintains that a true autobiography is almost an impossibility, and that man is bound to lie about himself. He considers that Rousseau certainly told lies about himself in his confessions, and even intentionally lied out of vanity. I am convinced that Heine is right. I understand very well that sometimes one may only, just out of sheer vanity, attribute regular crimes to oneself, and indeed I can very well conceive that kind of vanity. But Heine judged people who made their consciousnesses to the public. I, however, am writing for myself, and wish to declare, once and for all, that if I write as though I were addressing readers, that is simply because it is easier for me to write in that way. It is merely a question of form, only an empty form. I shall never have readers. I have made this plain already. I don't wish to be hampered by any restrictions in compiling my notes. I shall not attempt any system or method. I will jot things down as I remember them. But here, perhaps someone will take me at my word and ask me, if you really don't count on readers, why do you make such compacts with yourself, and on paper too? That is, that you won't accept any system or method, that you will jot things down as you remember them, etc., etc. Why do you keep explaining? Why do you keep apologizing? Well, there it is, I answer. Incidentally, there is a whole psychological system in this, or perhaps I am simply a coward, and perhaps also that I purposefully imagine an audience before me in order to conduct myself in a more dignified manner while I am jotting things down. There are perhaps thousands of reasons. And here is still something else. What precisely is my object in writing? If it is not for the public, then after all, why would I not simply recall these incidents in my own mind without putting them on paper? Quite so. But yet it is somehow more dignified on paper. There is something more impressive in it. I will be able to criticize myself better, improve my style. Besides, perhaps I will really get relief from writing. Today, for instance, I am particularly oppressed by a certain memory from the distant past. It came back to my mind vividly a few days ago, and since then has remained with me like an annoying tune that one cannot get rid of. And yet I must get rid of it. I have hundreds of such memories, but at times some single one stands out from the hundreds that oppress me. For some reason, I believe that if I write it down, I will get rid of it. Why not try? Besides, I am bored, and I never do anything. Writing will really be a sort of work. They say work makes a man kind-hearted and honest. Well, here is a chance for me, anyway. It is snowing today. A wet, yellow, dingy snow. It fell yesterday, too, and a few days ago. I rather think that I remembered that incident which I cannot shake off now, apropos of the wet snow. And so, let it be a story apropos of the wet snow. All right, everybody, from the underground, that was part 1 of Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. Have you heard that before? Have you read that? I can, I suppose, tell a story apropos to my introduction to the story. It was working at the last job that I held before COVID-19 came, and before that, before I was let go for being replaced by a man with 9 years more experience for me. I was a technician. I was fixing medical equipment. But it was sitting behind that desk, tinkering on forceps and flaps and hammers and spoons, that I began listening to Jordan Peterson's lectures online. I came to the channel out of boredom, but I was introduced to that prior when I visited my friend at his brother's funeral. He told me about Jordan Peterson and how he'd been following him and had been inspired by him. I wasn't in such a bad place. In fact, I was in a great place, but I looked into his channel anyways, and after kind of just eating everything up, I needed to latch onto something that I could internalize more than his lectures, the professor. So we offered at one point that that Notes from Underground was a terribly funny short story, that it described human capacity very succinctly, and that well, in short, that Dostoyevsky was a nearly prophetic genius, if his propheticism came from nothing else but just an amazing sense of logic and intuitive understanding of mankind and the individual's relationship to society, and vice versa, how society relates to the individual, how both constructs compose each other, how the macro and the micro personality dovetail into one another. And so I want to know, is the sum greater than its parts? Is society people plus their summation? Or is it just people equaling society? I don't expect there's going to be an answer for that. I hate to think that it's rhetorical, but let that be an example of some lofty philosophical thoughts that Dostoyevsky seems to inspire. Well, I suppose from the underground, that will be our question posed after reading part 1 of Notes from Underground. Please, I implore you, write down your own questions. Let's discuss those too. And write down everything, anything that comes to you. History will judge whether it was worth you writing after all, but we're not going to know for a while, so I think it'd be better to do it now. I think it would be better, out of a selfish reasoning, I think it would be better if you got it off your chest and shared it with me and with everybody here, because whether or not it's obviously worth saying, it's going to allude accidentally to something more positively truthful. We're going to study reading between lines. We're going to recognize a kernel of truth in everything, and no greater summation than the half-truth. And we're going to compile all of our half-truths together, and we're going to go forward and create something with those. I think maybe that's what the underground can be worth for now. So, thanks everybody. Thank you very much. From the battle-worn heart of Great Turrican Studios. You can see it in my eyes and my voice. I'm bloody tired. But I cannot wait to do this again tomorrow. So, I'll see you then. Good night, everybody.